Picture this: Antarctica, 2012. A Russian research team working in the most isolated place on Earth suddenly goes silent. No distress calls, no warnings, just complete radio silence. For 5 days, the world heard nothing from the scientists who had just accomplished what many thought impossible. They had drilled through nearly 4 kilometers of ancient ice to reach a lake that had been sealed off from the world for more than 20 million years. Lake Vostok, a body of water larger than Lake Ontario, trapped beneath the ice in complete darkness, untouched by sunlight or air, since before humans walked the earth. And then, just as they broke through, just as they were about to reveal what they found in those primordial waters, everything went dark. The official statement came later, of course. Technical difficulties, they said. Communication problems in the harsh Antarctic environment. Nothing unusual, but those who knew the team, those who understood the level of preparation that goes into such expeditions, they knew something else was at play. Because these weren't amateur explorers, these were some of Russia's most experienced polar scientists, equipped with state-of-the-art communication systems, backed by decades of Soviet and Russian Antarctic research. They don't just disappear. They don't just go silent. Not unless something extraordinary happens. Not unless they find something that someone, somewhere, doesn't want the world to know about. Before we dive deeper into this mystery, if you're fascinated by hidden truths and unexplained phenomena, make sure you're subscribed to this channel because we're going to uncover every layer of this story. Hit that like button if you want to see more content like this, and share this video with someone who loves a good mystery because what you're about to hear will challenge everything you think you know about our planet. The story of Lake Vostok doesn't begin in 2012. It begins much earlier, in the darkest days of the Cold War, when both superpowers were racing not just to conquer space, but to uncover the secrets buried beneath the ice at the bottom of the world. The Soviets established Vostok Station in 1957 during the International Geophysical Year. It was one of the most ambitious scientific outposts ever created, positioned at the heart of East Antarctica, at the geomagnetic South Pole. The location wasn't chosen randomly. The Soviets knew something was there, something worth the enormous cost and danger of maintaining a base in the coldest place on Earth, where temperatures regularly dropped to minus 80 degrees Celsius, where the air was so thin that simply breathing felt like drowning. For years, scientists at Vostok Station conducted routine research, climate studies, ice core drilling, atmospheric measurements, or so they claimed. But there were always whispers, always rumors among the international scientific community about what the Russians were really doing there. Why did they need such a large facility? Why the military presence? Why the unusual security protocols for what was supposed to be a civilian research station? The answers started to emerge in the 1970s when seismic surveys began detecting something unusual beneath the ice, something that shouldn't exist. The data showed a massive liquid body, a subglacial lake of extraordinary size, trapped beneath nearly 4,000 meters of ice. At first, many scientists were skeptical. How could liquid water exist in such an environment? The pressure alone should have been impossible. But as more data came in, as satellites confirmed what the seismic readings suggested, the reality became undeniable. Lake Vostok was real, and it was enormous. Roughly 250 kilometers long and 50 kilometers wide, containing more than 5,000 cubic kilometers of fresh water. But here's where it gets truly strange. The lake wasn't frozen. Despite being in the coldest region on Earth, despite the crushing weight of kilometers of ice above it, the water remained liquid. How? The official explanation pointed to geothermal heat from below, warming the water just enough to keep it from freezing. But some scientists began to wonder if there was another explanation, something about the lake itself, something about what lived in those dark waters that generated its own heat. The discovery of Lake Vostok sent shockwaves through the scientific community, because if liquid water could exist in such extreme conditions, it meant that life might exist there too, life that had been isolated from the rest of the world for millions of years. Life that had evolved in complete darkness under crushing pressure in a sealed ecosystem that had no contact with the surface. It was, in essence, an alien world right here on Earth. A perfect laboratory for studying how life might exist on other planets, on the ice moons of Jupiter and Saturn, in environments we once thought were completely sterile. The implications were staggering, and certain people, certain organizations understood that long before the public ever heard the name Lake Vostok. The race to reach the lake began in earnest in the 1990s. The Russians had the advantage. They were already there. They had the infrastructure, the experience, the determination. But they also had something else. They had records, Soviet-era documents, research that had been classified for decades. Because while the West was just learning about Lake Vostok, the Soviets had suspected its existence for much longer. Some researchers claimed that Soviet scientists had detected anomalies beneath Vostok Station as early as the 1960s. Strange readings, unusual electromagnetic signatures, sounds that shouldn't exist. And they had been quietly investigating, quietly drilling, long before the international community became aware of what lay beneath the ice. By 1998, the Russian team had drilled down more than 3,600 meters. They were getting close, but then something unexpected happened. International pressure forced them to stop. Environmental groups raised concerns about contamination. What if the drill introduced modern bacteria into this pristine ancient ecosystem? What if they destroyed a unique biosphere before they even discovered it? The Russians agreed to halt drilling until new protocols could be developed. Or at least, that's what they said publicly, because according to some sources, the drilling never really stopped. It just became more secretive, more carefully managed, hidden from international observers who might ask too many questions. The official resumption of drilling occurred in 2005 using new techniques designed to prevent contamination. The drill was modified, new fluids were used, every precaution was supposedly taken. But progress was slow. The deeper they went, the stranger things became. The ice itself was unusual. In cores pulled from the depths, scientists found ice that was millions of years old, containing air bubbles from ancient atmospheres, preserving a record of Earth's climate going back to times before the first ice ages. But there were anomalies in those cores, layers that didn't match known geological patterns, concentrations of minerals that shouldn't exist, and in some samples, traces of something organic, something that suggested life existed down there, waiting in the dark. The drill team reported increasing technical difficulties as they approached the lake. Equipment malfunctions became more frequent. Drill bits broke more often than expected. Electronic systems experienced interference that engineers couldn't explain. Some workers began to report strange experiences, unusual sounds coming from the drill hole, feelings of being watched, dreams that were too vivid, too similar among different team members to be coincidence. The official reports dismiss these as hallucinations caused by isolation and the extreme environment. Vostok Station was one of the most psychologically challenging places on Earth. Long winters in complete darkness, temperatures that could kill in minutes, the constant howl of wind. It was only natural that people would experience some psychological effects, but those who worked there, those who experienced these phenomena firsthand, they weren't convinced by the official explanations. By 2011, the drill was within meters of the lake's surface. The team could sense they were close. The ice was changing consistency. Temperature readings were fluctuating. And then they detected something that changed everything. Water. Not just traces of moisture, but actual liquid water seeping up through the drill hole, rising from below. The lake was reaching up to meet them, as if it knew they were coming, as if something down there was aware of their presence and responding to it. The team reported this to their superiors. Decisions were made at the highest levels, and in January 2012, they made the final push, January 20th, 2012. After decades of work, after drilling through nearly 4 kilometers of ancient ice, the Russian team finally broke through into Lake Vostok. The drill penetrated the lake's surface. Water rushed up through the borehole, flooding the shaft, freezing instantly in the sub-zero temperatures. The team quickly sealed the hole, preventing contamination, following the protocols that had been so carefully developed. And then they began their analysis. They started examining the water samples, the frozen lake water that had surged upward. They deployed their instruments. And what they found, what they discovered in those first hours after breakthrough, that's when everything changed. The initial reports were excited, almost euphoric. The team had succeeded where others had only dreamed. They had reached an alien world beneath the ice, and it was alive. The water samples contained microorganisms, bacteria unlike anything in existing databases, life forms that had evolved in complete isolation for millions of years. But it wasn't just unknown bacteria. There were larger organisms, complex structures, things that looked like they might be multicellular life, though unlike any multicellular organisms known to science. The team worked frantically to document everything, to collect samples, to understand what they were seeing. And then they found something else. Something in the water that wasn't biological. An object, something artificial, something that had no business being at the bottom of a lake that had been sealed for 20 million years. This is where the official narrative becomes murky. According to the statements released to the press, the team successfully reached the lake, collected samples, and then stopped operations for the winter season as planned. The station would be evacuated, as it was every year during the darkest months, and work would resume the following summer. But multiple sources, including Russian scientists who later spoke anonymously, tell a different story. They say the team didn't stop working. They say orders came from Moscow to continue operations despite the approaching winter. They say the team was told to retrieve the object they had found, to document it, to understand what it was before anyone else could interfere. And then came the silence. 5 days after the breakthrough, all communication from Vostok Station ceased. The automated weather systems kept transmitting. The power generators kept running. But the human element, the team of scientists and support staff, they went completely dark. No radio contact, no satellite phone calls, no emergency beacons. For 5 days, the most isolated research station on Earth became a ghost town, with no one knowing if the people inside were alive or dead, if they had made some terrible discovery, or if something had discovered them. The Russian government's response to the communication blackout was immediate and overwhelming. Within hours of losing contact, military transport aircraft were dispatched from Moscow. Not civilian rescue planes, but military transporters, carrying not just rescue personnel but heavily armed security forces. The official explanation was that this was standard protocol for any emergency in Antarctica. But those familiar with Russian Antarctic operations knew better. Standard rescue missions didn't require special forces. They didn't require the level of secrecy that suddenly surrounded Vostok Station. Something else was happening, something that required soldiers, not scientists. When the rescue team finally reached Vostok Station, they found the facility intact but abandoned. According to leaked reports, the base showed no signs of struggle, no indication of what had caused the communications failure. The equipment was functional, food was still in the kitchen, personal belongings remained in quarters, but the people were gone. Not all of them, it turned out. Some team members were found in the medical bay, unconscious but alive, suffering from what doctors later described as severe psychological trauma and exposure to unknown biological agents. Others were located in the drilling facility in a state of shock, unable or unwilling to communicate about what they had experienced. But several members of the team were never accounted for. The official death toll was listed as 3 scientists lost to equipment failure and environmental exposure. Their bodies, the reports claimed, were recovered and returned to Russia for burial. But here's what doesn't add up. Multiple sources, including family members of the deceased, reported that the caskets were sealed, that viewing was not permitted, that the burials happened with unusual speed and secrecy. And some family members, those who asked too many questions, those who demanded answers, they were visited by government officials. They were told that their loved ones had died serving their country, that the details were classified for national security reasons, and that continuing to investigate would be viewed as unpatriotic. In Russia, that kind of warning carries weight. The survivors who were extracted from Vostok Station were immediately quarantined, not at a civilian hospital, but at a military medical facility outside Moscow, one known for handling biological hazards and classified medical cases. They remained there for months. When some were finally released, they were different, quieter, haunted. Several refused to speak about their experience at all. One scientist, in a rare moment of candor during a private conversation that was later leaked, said only this: "We opened a door that should have stayed closed. We found something that has been waiting, and now it knows we're here." When pressed for details, he refused to say more. Within weeks, he resigned from his position, left Moscow, and disappeared from public life. In the months following the incident, the Russian government and affiliated scientific institutions worked to control the narrative. Press releases emphasized the successful breakthrough to Lake Vostok. They celebrated the discovery of unique microbial life. They talked about the scientific significance of finding organisms that had evolved in isolation for millions of years. International journals published papers about the extremophile bacteria found in the lake samples. Conferences were held discussing the implications for astrobiology, for the search for life on other worlds. It was a masterclass in misdirection, focusing attention on the interesting but ultimately conventional discoveries while completely ignoring the questions that really mattered. What about the communication blackout? Technical failure in the extreme conditions, said the official reports. What about the missing scientists? Tragic accidents, unfortunate, but not uncommon in Antarctic research. What about the military response? Standard emergency protocol. What about the quarantine, precautionary measures to ensure no contamination from the ancient lake water? Every question had an answer. Every concern was addressed with calm, reasonable explanations. And for most of the world, that was enough. The story of Lake Vostok faded from headlines, becoming just another interesting scientific achievement, a footnote in the history of polar exploration. But in certain circles, among certain researchers and journalists who specialized in investigating things that governments preferred to keep hidden, the questions didn't stop. They noted the inconsistencies in the official timeline. They documented the unusual personnel changes at institutions involved with the Vostok project. They tracked the flow of money, the sudden influx of funding to certain laboratories conducting classified research. And they noticed something else. Starting in 2013, multiple countries began increasing their activities in Antarctica. Not just research activities, but military exercises, infrastructure development, the establishment of new bases and facilities. It was subtle, spread out over years, but the pattern was clear to those paying attention. Something had changed. Something discovered at Lake Vostok had altered the strategic calculus of multiple nations. The United States Antarctic program began conducting its own deep drilling operations, ostensibly searching for similar subglacial lakes. The British Antarctic Survey expanded its facilities. China, previously a minor player in Antarctic research, suddenly became one of the most active nations on the continent, building multiple new stations and deploying advanced equipment. Even smaller nations, countries with limited resources and no historical interest in polar research, began establishing footholds in Antarctica. Why? What were they all looking for? Or what were they trying to prevent others from finding? One of the most intriguing aspects of the Lake Vostok mystery is the anomaly that satellites had been detecting for years before the drilling reached the lake. High-resolution radar and gravitational mapping revealed something strange at the southern end of the lake, buried in the sediment at the bottom. The object, whatever it was, measured roughly 100 meters in length and appeared to be metallic, or at least composed of material with significantly different density than the surrounding rock and sediment. The Russian team had been specifically directed to drill near this location. They knew about the anomaly. Finding it, understanding it, that was one of their primary objectives. Leaked communications from team members in the days before the blackout mentioned the object. They described it as geometric, clearly not natural, and exhibiting unusual properties. One scientist wrote in a message that was intercepted and later published by WikiLeaks, "The structure resonates. We can measure the frequency. It's responding to our presence, changing its output as we get closer. This isn't geological. This isn't natural. Someone built this, and they built it a very long time ago." The message ended abruptly. No follow-up communications from that researcher were ever received. Here's where we need to consider the implications. If an artificial structure exists at the bottom of Lake Vostok, If something built and placed there by intelligent beings rests beneath millions of years of ice, then we're forced to confront some deeply unsettling possibilities. Either human history is far older than we believe, stretching back millions of years rather than thousands, or something non-human, some other intelligence, was active on Earth long before humans evolved. Both possibilities challenge fundamental assumptions about our planet's history, about our place in the universe, about the nature of intelligence and civilization. And both possibilities are exactly the kind of discovery that powerful institutions might want to keep secret. Some researchers have drawn connections between the Lake Vostok anomaly and other mysteries. The ancient maps that show Antarctica without ice, suggesting that someone mapped the continent millions of years ago when it was still habitable. The legends found in various cultures about advanced civilizations that existed in the distant past and were destroyed by catastrophe. The strange artifacts occasionally found in coal deposits or deep rock layers, objects that shouldn't exist in strata millions of years old, according to conventional archaeology. Could Lake Vostok be the key that connects all these disparate mysteries? Could it be evidence of something that challenges our entire understanding of human history and planetary evolution? There's another theory, one that's even more disturbing to consider. What if the structure at the bottom of Lake Vostok isn't ancient at all? What if it's a probe, a monitoring station, something placed there by an intelligence that isn't from Earth? Antarctica is, after all, the perfect location for an alien outpost, isolated, inhospitable to human settlement, covered by miles of ice that would preserve and hide anything placed there. If you were an extraterrestrial civilization studying Earth, if you wanted to observe our planet without being detected, Antarctica would be ideal, and a subglacial lake sealed off and protected would be an excellent location for equipment, for biological samples, for a base of operations that could function undisturbed for millions of years. Let's return to what the Russian team found in the lake water itself. The official reports mentioned unknown microorganisms, which is interesting but not unprecedented. Extreme environments on Earth regularly yield new species of bacteria and archaea. But there were other discoveries, findings that were mentioned briefly and then quietly forgotten in subsequent scientific literature. Reports of the initial water samples described organisms that seemed to defy classification. Single-celled creatures with genetic material that didn't match any known form of DNA or RNA. Multicellular structures that exhibited behaviors suggesting intelligence or at least complex problem-solving abilities despite having no obvious nervous system. One leaked laboratory report described an organism extracted from the frozen lake water that displayed remarkable abilities. When isolated in a petri dish, it began reorganizing the growth medium around it, creating patterns that resembled circuitry or computational networks. When researchers introduced other bacteria into the dish, the organism from Lake Vostok absorbed them, incorporating their genetic material, adapting and changing in real time. It could survive extreme temperature fluctuations from near absolute zero to the boiling point of water. It was resistant to radiation, to acids, to every sterilization technique the laboratory tried. And most disturbing of all, it seemed to learn. When researchers attempted to destroy samples using heat, subsequent samples from the same culture line began producing heat-resistant proteins before being exposed to high temperatures, as if the organism could somehow anticipate what was coming. This kind of adaptive intelligence at the microbial level shouldn't be possible according to conventional biology. Evolution requires time, generations, the gradual accumulation of beneficial mutations. But these organisms from Lake Vostok appeared to evolve consciously, deliberately, rewriting their own genetic code in response to environmental challenges. It raised a terrifying question. What if these weren't simple microbes? What if they were something more sophisticated? Perhaps the smallest components of a much larger intelligence, a distributed consciousness that existed in the lake water itself. What if the Russian team hadn't just found life in Lake Vostok? What if they had awakened it? The medical reports from the scientists who were hospitalized after the incident are particularly telling. Beyond the psychological trauma, beyond the shock and confusion, there were biological abnormalities, changes to their brain chemistry, unusual neural activity patterns, and in one case, according to a leaked medical file, the presence of unknown microorganisms in the patient's bloodstream. Organisms that matched samples from Lake Vostok. How did they get there? Had there been a containment breach? Had someone been exposed to the lake water? Or had something from the lake deliberately infected the researchers, using them as hosts, as vectors to reach the surface world? Consider what a discovery like this means for global politics and security. If Lake Vostok contains evidence of ancient non-human intelligence, if it harbors life forms with capabilities that exceed anything in modern biotechnology, then whoever controls that knowledge, whoever possesses samples and data from the lake, holds potentially world-changing power. The military applications alone are staggering. Organisms that can survive in any environment, that can adapt and evolve on demand, could revolutionize everything from biological warfare to space exploration. Materials or technology recovered from an ancient structure could represent a leap forward of centuries or millennia in human capability. This explains the sudden international interest in Antarctica after 2012. It explains why nations with limited resources began investing heavily in Antarctic research. It explains the unusual security measures, the military presence, the secrecy that surrounds certain facilities and operations on the continent. There's a new kind of Cold War happening, not over territory or ideology, but over access to whatever Lake Vostok contains. And this Cold War is being fought in the shadows, away from public awareness, by organizations and agencies that most people don't even know exist. There are whispers in intelligence communities about a multinational task force dedicated to managing the Lake Vostok situation, not an official organization, not something with a public face or acknowledged mandate, but a coalition of scientific, military, and intelligence agencies from several major powers who have agreed to coordinate their activities, to share information to a limited degree, and most importantly, to maintain silence about what they've really found. This task force supposedly operates above governmental oversight, answerable only to a small group of leaders who have been briefed on the full truth. If such an organization exists, and the evidence suggests it does, then we're looking at one of the most significant conspiracies in human history, a coordinated effort by world powers to hide a discovery that would fundamentally alter our understanding of reality. What would happen if the truth came out? If proof of ancient advanced civilization or extraterrestrial presence were revealed to the public, some argue it would cause panic, social collapse, the breakdown of religious and philosophical systems that depend on humans being unique, special, the pinnacle of creation. Others believe humanity has a right to know, that keeping such knowledge secret is both unethical and dangerous, that the truth will come out eventually, and that a controlled revelation would be better than an uncontrolled leak. The debate happens behind closed doors, in secure facilities, among people who have access to information that would stagger the imagination of ordinary citizens going about their daily lives with no idea what lies beneath the ice at the bottom of the world. The story doesn't end in 2012. Activities at Lake Vostok have continued, though with much less public visibility. The Russians maintain their presence at Vostok Station, conducting what they describe as ongoing research into the lake's ecosystem. But satellite imagery analyzed by independent researchers shows unusual construction at the site, new buildings with configurations that don't match typical research facilities, power consumption levels that seem excessive for the stated activities, vehicle tracks leading away from the station into areas of the ice sheet that have no obvious scientific interest. In 2017, a team of French scientists working in the region reported unusual electromagnetic readings emanating from the direction of Lake Vostok, pulses of energy and frequencies that don't correspond to any known natural phenomenon. When they attempted to investigate further, they were denied access to the area by Russian authorities, citing safety concerns. The French team's equipment was confiscated and several members were briefly detained before being released with warnings about respecting international treaty obligations. The incident received minimal media coverage, just a brief mention in trade publications read by polar researchers, but those who knew what to look for recognized the significance. There have been other incidents, other strange occurrences in the vicinity of Lake Vostok that suggest something is ongoing, something active. In 2019, a satellite captured thermal imagery showing a massive heat plume rising from the ice above the lake, far too large to be explained by normal geothermal activity. The explanation given was a volcanic event, a release of heat from magma chambers deep beneath the continent. But volcanologists pointed out that the thermal signature didn't match known volcanic patterns. It looked more like something releasing energy from below the ice in a controlled manner, like a massive power plant operating beneath the surface. Most recently, in 2023, a group of amateur radio enthusiasts monitoring high-frequency transmissions from Antarctica picked up strange signals. Bursts of data in no recognizable format, repeating at irregular intervals, originating from coordinates that placed the source directly above Lake Vostok. When they published their findings online, the posts were quickly removed. The individuals involved were contacted by government agencies in their respective countries and told that they had intercepted classified communications, that further publication would result in legal consequences. But copies of the recordings survived, circulating in dark corners of the internet, analyzed by cryptographers and linguists trying to understand if the signals contain messages, if someone or something is broadcasting from beneath the Antarctic ice. There are people who have dedicated their lives to uncovering the truth about Lake Vostok, scientists who risk their careers, journalists who follow leads despite threats and intimidation, former government employees who can't live with the weight of secrets they've been forced to keep. These individuals form a loose network, sharing information through encrypted channels, meeting in person when possible, always aware that they're being watched by agencies that prefer the truth to remain hidden. They've compiled an enormous amount of evidence, documents that have been leaked, testimonies from anonymous sources, analysis of satellite data, and public records that reveal patterns invisible to casual observers. One former Russian scientist who worked peripherally on the Vostok project before his dismissal in 2014 has spoken publicly despite the risks. Using the pseudonym Alexei Kuznetsov to protect his identity, he gave an interview to an independent media outlet in which he described a project called Pandora that was initiated after the 2012 breakthrough. According to Kuznetsov, Pandora's objective is to study and potentially weaponize the organisms found in Lake Vostok. He claims that laboratories in Russia and possibly in other countries are working with samples taken from the lake, attempting to understand and control their unique properties. He describes experiments in which these organisms were introduced to various environments, including human tissue cultures, with results that both fascinated and terrified the researchers involved. Kuznetsov also mentioned the structure at the bottom of the lake, though his knowledge of it was limited. He said that a remote-operated submersible was deployed into Lake Vostok sometime in 2013, that it reached the bottom of the lake and photographed the anomaly. The images, he claimed, showed something that was clearly artificial, covered in symbols or writing in no known language, emitting some form of energy or radiation that affected the submersible's electronics. The vehicle managed to return to the surface with its data, but attempts to deploy a second submersible failed. The next drone sent down never returned, as if something in the lake had decided not to allow further intrusions. Another source, an American intelligence analyst who leaked documents through secure channels before disappearing in 2020, provided information about international coordination regarding Lake Vostok. The documents detailed agreements between the United States, Russia, China, the United Kingdom, and several other nations regarding Antarctic research, and specifically about how to handle discoveries that could pose risks to global stability. The protocols outlined how information would be shared, how public statements would be coordinated, and under what circumstances military force could be deployed to protect sites of interest. The existence of such agreements, if the documents are genuine, proves that world governments are coordinating on something significant, something they believe justifies overriding normal diplomatic rivalries and national interests. So what is really down there? What did the Russian team find in Lake Vostok that prompted such extreme reactions? Based on the evidence available, on the testimony of sources and the patterns of activity observed since 2012, we can construct a disturbing picture. Lake Vostok contains a unique and ancient ecosystem, one that has evolved in complete isolation for millions of years. The life forms in that lake possess capabilities that challenge our understanding of biology. They are adaptive in ways that seem impossible, intelligent in ways that shouldn't exist at the microbial level. These organisms may be the product of natural evolution under extreme conditions, or they may be something else, something engineered, perhaps the remnants of an ancient biotechnology that has survived and evolved on its own. At the bottom of the lake sits a structure, an object that is definitely artificial, definitely ancient, and definitely not human in origin. This structure appears to be some form of technology, perhaps a probe or monitoring station, possibly a storage facility or computer of some kind. It's still functional, still emitting energy, still capable of interacting with its environment. When humans approached it, when the Russian drill team got close, it activated or increased its activity level. It may have released the organisms into the lake deliberately, or perhaps those organisms are part of its function, biological machines designed to maintain it, protect it, or gather information about anything that discovers it. The Russian team that made first contact with this reality, that saw the structure and encountered the organisms, they were changed by the experience. Some physically, infected or altered by exposure to something from the lake. Others mentally, traumatized by seeing evidence that humans are not alone, that intelligence existed on Earth or visited Earth millions of years before our species emerged, that everything we believe about our history and our place in the universe is based on incomplete information. The knowledge broke some of them, others survived, but could never speak about what they saw without risking everything. And a few, perhaps, didn't survive at all, but were taken or changed into something else. Something that serves the interests of whatever dwells beneath the ice. The governments that control access to Lake Vostok, that have samples and data from the drilling project, they face an impossible choice. Reveal the truth and risk global upheaval, the collapse of social systems, possibly panic and conflict as nations struggle to control access to the technology and biological materials. Or maintain the secret, continue studying what was found, try to understand and harness it before making any public acknowledgement. So far, they've chosen secrecy. But secrets of this magnitude have a way of coming to light. Leaks happen, people talk. And as more nations gain access to Antarctica, as more drilling projects reach other subglacial lakes, the probability of independent discovery increases. We opened a door in 2012. The Russian team drilled through nearly 4 kilometers of ice and reached a world that had been sealed away since before human civilization existed. What we found there, what still waits in those dark waters, it knows about us now. It's aware that we've discovered it. And according to some sources, according to the patterns of activity detected in recent years, it may be responding. The electromagnetic pulses, the thermal anomalies, the strange signals. They could be attempts at communication, or they could be something else. Preparation. The structure at the bottom of Lake Vostok might be waking up, activating systems that have been dormant for millions of years, responding to the presence of intelligent life on the surface. What those systems do, what their purpose is, we don't know. But we may find out sooner than we'd like. The organisms from the lake, if they've been taken to laboratories around the world, if researchers are studying them and experimenting with them, then the potential for disaster is obvious. These are life forms that can adapt to any environment, that possess capabilities beyond our biotechnology, that may have some form of collective intelligence. If they escape containment, if they're released deliberately or accidentally into Earth's biosphere, the consequences are unpredictable. They could be harmless, curiosities that find their niche and coexist with terrestrial life. Or they could be invasive in ways we can't imagine, organisms that could outcompete and replace existing species, that could fundamentally alter the ecology of the planet. Some scientists who've studied the leaked data believe that these organisms, if released, could trigger a mass extinction event. Others think they might merge with terrestrial life, accelerating evolution, creating new forms that combine the ancient DNA from Lake Vostok with modern species. Either scenario would change Earth forever. And then there's the larger question that haunts everyone who knows about Lake Vostok. If there's a structure there, if something was built and placed in that lake millions of years ago, then who built it? Where did they come from? Are they still around, watching to see what we do with our discovery? Ancient human civilization advanced beyond anything in our historical records is one possibility, though it requires us to completely revise our understanding of human history. Extraterrestrial visitors who used Earth as a laboratory or way station is another possibility, one that opens up even more disturbing questions about why they came here, what they did while they were here, and whether they might come back. The silence that fell over Vostok Station in 2012 was just the beginning. It was the moment when humanity stumbled into something far larger than ourselves, something that has been waiting beneath the ice for longer than our species has existed. The Russian team who drilled into Lake Vostok, they were the first to confront this reality, but they won't be the last. More drilling projects are planned, more nations are preparing to explore Antarctica's hidden lakes, and each new expedition, each new attempt to pierce the ice and reach the water below, it's another roll of the dice, another chance that will awaken something that should have remained asleep, that will unleash something that we have no ability to control or understand. The truth about Lake Vostok is still emerging. Pieces of the puzzle continue to surface despite efforts to keep them hidden. Brave individuals continue to leak information, to speak out, to demand transparency. And eventually, whether through official disclosure or uncontrolled revelation, the world will learn what lies beneath the ice. When that day comes, when humanity as a whole confronts the reality that we are not alone, that we have never been alone, that ancient mysteries and alien presences are part of our planet's history, everything will change. Our religions, our philosophies, our sense of who we are and where we came from, all of it will need to be reconsidered in light of the evidence. Until then, Lake Vostok remains. The structure at its bottom continues to emit its signals, to resonate at frequencies we're only beginning to detect. The organisms in its water continue to exist, possibly to multiply, possibly to wait for their opportunity to spread beyond the boundaries of their ancient prison. And the governments that know the truth continue to guard their secrets, to conduct their research, to prepare for outcomes they hope will never come to pass, but know they must plan for. The drilling in 2012 wasn't just a scientific achievement, it was first contact. And we still don't know what we've made contact with. There are nights when former members of the Vostok team wake up screaming according to their families. Nights when they speak in their sleep about things beneath the ice, about voices that don't use sound, about eyes that watch from the darkness of ancient water. These are not the ravings of madmen. These are trained scientists, rational people who spent their careers studying objective reality, now haunted by something that defies explanation. One psychologist who treated several of the survivors noted in his private records that they all described similar experiences. Dreams of vast intelligences observing them, sensations of being studied like insects under a microscope, and a recurring vision of the ice melting, of something rising from Lake Vostok to spread across the world like a tide that cannot be stopped. The phenomenon isn't limited to the Russian team. Scientists from other nations who've worked on Antarctic subglacial lake projects, particularly those who've studied samples or data from Vostok, have reported similar experiences. A British researcher who analyzed water samples in 2013 began having seizures. During these episodes, witnesses reported that she would speak in unknown languages, producing sounds that linguistic experts couldn't identify as belonging to any human language family. Medical scans showed unusual neural activity, patterns of brain function that neurologists had never seen before. She was quietly removed from the project and hasn't published any scientific work since. Her family says she lives quietly now, far from any research facility, and refuses to discuss her time working with materials from Lake Vostok. An American microbiologist who spent 6 months studying the genetic material of organisms from the lake samples had a complete psychological breakdown. Before his hospitalization, he told colleagues that the DNA he was sequencing contained patterns, mathematical relationships that couldn't be natural, that suggested the genetic code itself had been engineered. He claimed that hidden within the seemingly random base pair sequences were messages, information encoded at a level far more sophisticated than anything human genetic engineering could produce. He became obsessed with decoding these messages, filling notebooks with equations and symbols. His colleagues dismissed it as mental illness brought on by stress and isolation. But some of those notebooks survived, and when analyzed by mathematicians and cryptographers, they revealed something disturbing. The patterns he had identified were real. The genetic code of the Lake Vostok organisms did contain non-random mathematical structures. Whether these structures constitute actual messages or serve some other function remains unknown, but their existence suggests that life in Lake Vostok might not be entirely natural in origin. Consider the implications of engineered life existing in a lake sealed for 20 million years. Either the engineering happened within the lake after it was sealed, which would require an intelligence existing there capable of manipulating genetics at a sophisticated level, or the organisms were placed there before the lake was sealed, which pushes the timeline of advanced biotechnology back millions of years before humans existed. Both scenarios are paradigm-shattering. Both require us to accept that something we didn't know about, something outside our historical narrative, has been active on this planet for far longer than we imagined. There's another angle to this mystery that receives less attention but may be equally significant. Lake Vostok isn't the only subglacial lake in Antarctica. Over 400 such lakes have been identified beneath the ice sheet. Some are small, just a few kilometers across. Others rival Vostok in size, and according to seismic data, many of them are connected by subglacial rivers, channels of water flowing beneath the ice, linking these isolated ecosystems into a vast underground network. If Lake Vostok contains unusual life, if it harbors ancient structures or technologies, what about the other lakes? Could there be additional sites, additional anomalies waiting to be discovered, or are they all connected, all part of a single system that spans the entire continent? Some researchers have proposed that Antarctica beneath its ice is not just a continent, but a habitat, a place where something lives, something that is adapted to the unique conditions of subglacial existence, something that might have been there long before the ice came. The continent wasn't always frozen. Millions of years ago, Antarctica had forests, rivers, abundant life on its surface. When the climate changed, when the ice sheets advanced and covered everything, surface life died or migrated away. But what if something survived beneath the ice? What if the subglacial lakes became refuges for organisms or civilizations that adapted to life in darkness and cold, that built their own world in the spaces beneath the ice sheet? It sounds like science fiction, but the evidence from Lake Vostok suggests that science fiction and science fact may be closer than we ever imagined. The magnetic anomalies detected in Antarctica add another layer to the mystery. The continent has unusual magnetic properties, areas where compass readings behave erratically, where the Earth's magnetic field shows distortions that geologists struggle to explain using conventional models. Some of these anomalies correlate with the locations of subglacial lakes, including Vostok. The structure at the bottom of Vostok, if it's made of unusual materials or generates its own electromagnetic fields, could be responsible for some of these distortions. But there are other anomalies across the continent, dozens of them, each marking a location where something beneath the ice is affecting the magnetic environment. Are these natural geological formations, concentrations of magnetic minerals in the bedrock, or are they markers? Signs of additional structures, a network of ancient installations spread across the continent. Military interest in these anomalies is well documented. Multiple nations have conducted aerial surveys of Antarctica using magnetometers and ground-penetrating radar, ostensibly for scientific research, but with involvement from military agencies that suggests other motivations. Flight paths have concentrated on areas with known anomalies, and in some cases, when significant readings are detected, the data is classified and removed from public databases. Independent researchers trying to study Antarctica's magnetic properties find that large sections of data that should be available through scientific repositories are missing or restricted. When they inquire about access, they're told the data is sensitive, that it relates to ongoing research that cannot be shared. But the pattern is clear. Someone is mapping something beneath the Antarctic ice, and they don't want the public to know what they're finding. Then there are the expeditions that never happened, or more accurately, the expeditions that happened but were never officially acknowledged. Satellite imagery has captured evidence of activity at remote Antarctic locations, places with no registered research stations, no publicly acknowledged scientific operations. Temporary facilities appear, operate for a few months, and then disappear, leaving only traces in the ice that fade over time. Aircraft and helicopters operate in these areas, visible in satellite data, but not appearing in any flight logs or mission reports. Personnel and equipment are deployed and extracted with precision that suggests military logistics. These black operations, conducted by nations that officially adhere to the Antarctic Treaty's provisions against militarization, indicate that something is happening on the continent that governments consider important enough to risk international censure and violation of treaty obligations. What are they doing at these secret sites? The most logical explanation is that they're investigating anomalies, drilling into lakes, exploring areas where ground-penetrating radar has detected something interesting. But there's another possibility that some researchers find compelling. What if they're not just investigating? What if they're recovering things? Artifacts, technology, biological samples, materials that have value beyond pure scientific interest, materials that could be weaponized, commercialized, used to gain strategic advantage. If the structure in Lake Vostok represents advanced technology, if similar structures exist in other locations, then a race is underway to find and claim them. A race conducted in secret because revealing its existence would require explaining what's being sought, and that explanation would expose truths that governments have decided the public isn't ready to hear. The economic implications are staggering. Imagine technology that's millions of years more advanced than ours. Materials with properties we can't currently manufacture, energy sources that could revolutionize civilization. The nation or corporation that gains access to such resources would achieve dominance in every field from military to industrial to technological. This isn't speculation. This is the logical consequence of the evidence. And it explains why so much money, so many resources are being poured into Antarctic operations despite the extreme costs and difficulties. The return on investment, if even a fraction of what's suspected to be there can be recovered and understood, would be incalculable. But there's a darker side to this pursuit. What if some of the technology or organisms recovered from beneath the ice are dangerous? What if, in the rush to exploit these discoveries, someone makes a mistake? Releases something that can't be contained? Uses something they don't fully understand with catastrophic results? The history of human technological development is filled with examples of unforeseen consequences. Nuclear weapons created pollution that will last for thousands of years. Chemical industries produced compounds that damage the ozone layer. Genetic engineering raises concerns about organisms escaping into the wild. Now imagine making similar mistakes with technology or biology that's millions of years beyond our understanding. The potential for disaster is enormous. Some whistleblowers have suggested that such disasters have already occurred on a small scale. Containment breaches in laboratories studying Lake Vostok materials, accidents during retrieval operations that exposed personnel to unknown organisms. Equipment failures that released energy or radiation into the environment. These incidents, if they happened, were contained and covered up. But each one represents a warning, a sign that we're playing with forces we don't fully comprehend. And the more aggressively we pursue the secrets beneath the ice, the greater the probability that something will go catastrophically wrong. There's also the question of what the original builders of the structure in Lake Vostok would think of our activities. If they're still around, still monitoring their installations, they're aware that humans have discovered one of their sites. They know we're studying it, attempting to understand it, possibly trying to access or reproduce the technology. How would an advanced intelligence view such actions? Would they see us as promising A young species taking its first steps toward greater understanding? Or would they see us as dangerous primitives who've stumbled onto something they're not ready for, who pose a threat that needs to be managed or eliminated? We have no way of knowing. We can't communicate with them because we don't know who or what they are, where they are, or even if they still exist. We're blind, fumbling in the dark, hoping that our ignorance doesn't provoke a response we're unprepared to handle. The indigenous peoples of various continents have legends about beings that came from the ice, from the far south in ancient times. Australian Aboriginal stories speak of sky beings who lived in the cold lands beyond the sea. South American tribes have myths about pale visitors who brought knowledge and then returned to the frozen south. These legends are usually dismissed as mythology, cultural stories with no basis in historical fact. But what if they're memories? What if thousands or tens of thousands of years ago, something from Antarctica made contact with human populations, left impressions, gave gifts of knowledge, and then retreated back to the ice? If the structures beneath Antarctica are millions of years old, if they've been active and functional for all that time, then periodic contact with the surface world would be possible, and such contacts, rare and strange, would become legends. Stories passed down through generations, distorted by time, but preserving a kernel of truth. Modern UFO sightings in the Antarctic region add another dimension to the mystery. There have been numerous reports from ship crews, aircraft pilots, and researchers of unusual aerial phenomena near Antarctica. Objects that move in ways that defy known physics, lights beneath the water of the Southern Ocean, craft that emerge from the sea and disappear into the sky. The official explanations cite weather phenomena, equipment malfunctions, misidentification of conventional objects. But the reports persist, and some come from highly credible witnesses, military personnel, and experienced pilots who know how to identify conventional aircraft and natural phenomena. Could these sightings be related to whatever exists beneath the Antarctic ice? If there are installations down there, if they're active, they would need to communicate with other locations, to resupply, to maintain themselves. Craft traveling to and from such installations would occasionally be seen, especially now that human activity in the region has increased. The connection between Lake Vostok and UFO phenomena is not mainstream, but among researchers who investigate both topics, the overlap is recognized. Some suggest that Antarctica is a base of operations for non-human intelligences, that the subglacial lakes provide perfect cover for facilities, that the structures detected by radar and seismic surveys are part of a much larger installation. Others propose that what's in Lake Vostok is related to historical UFO activity but isn't currently occupied, that it's an archaeological site rather than an active base. Either way, the implications are profound. If the UFO phenomenon is real, if it represents visitation by non-human intelligences, then Antarctica, and specifically Lake Vostok, may be a key location in understanding that phenomenon. Let's talk about the ice cores. The drilling at Vostok wasn't just about reaching the lake. The ice itself, the cores extracted as the drill descended, they contained information. Ice cores are time capsules, preserving atmospheric gases, dust, and other materials from the time when the ice formed. By analyzing ice cores, scientists can reconstruct Earth's climate history going back hundreds of thousands of years. The Vostok ice cores, drilled from one of the deepest parts of the Antarctic ice sheet, go back more than 400,000 years. But there are anomalies in those cores, layers where the composition doesn't match what should be there based on known climate patterns. Traces of elements that shouldn't exist in natural ice. And in some of the deepest sections, just above the interface with the lake, there are particles of unknown composition, microscopic fragments that don't match any known mineral or organic material. These particles were studied extensively but never publicly explained. Laboratory analysis showed they had unusual properties, molecular structures that didn't fit standard chemistry, crystalline patterns that suggested artificial manufacture. Where did they come from? The only possibility is the lake. Somehow material from Lake Vostok, or from the structure at its bottom, made its way up into the ice above it. Perhaps through volcanic activity, or through cracks in the lake's ceiling, or through some process we don't understand. But their presence in the ice cores means that whatever is in the lake has been interacting with its environment for a very long time, that it's not completely isolated, that there are mechanisms by which it can affect the world above. This discovery has implications for contamination fears. If material from the lake can reach the ice naturally, then the lake has already been contaminated by surface materials. The pristine isolation that scientists worried about disrupting with the drill, it never existed. The lake and the surface have been exchanging materials for millennia. This realization changed the approach to further drilling operations. If the lake isn't truly pristine, if it's been contaminated naturally over time, then the argument for not accessing it becomes weaker. And indeed, since 2012, the reluctance to drill into other subglacial lakes has diminished. Multiple projects are now underway or planned to access lakes across Antarctica, each one justified by the precedent of Lake Vostok. But here's the troubling part. If the lake has been contaminated from above, then organisms from the lake could have reached the surface. The unusual particles in the ice cores, could some of them be biological? Could microorganisms from Lake Vostok have been transported upward through the ice, reaching the surface, spreading into the Antarctic environment, or even beyond? Some researchers believe this has already happened, that the unique life forms of Lake Vostok have been slowly seeping into the wider world for thousands of years. If true, it means we've been exposed to these organisms already, that they're part of Earth's biosphere, potentially intermingling with terrestrial life. It would explain some biological mysteries, organisms found in extreme environments that don't fit evolutionary trees, that seem to have appeared suddenly without clear ancestors. The melting of Antarctic ice due to climate change adds urgency to these concerns. As the planet warms, as the ice sheets begin to retreat, the natural barriers separating subglacial lakes from the surface are weakening. Lake Vostok and hundreds of other lakes will eventually be exposed. When that happens, when millions of years of isolation end not through careful drilling, but through uncontrolled melting, everything in those lakes will be released into the environment. The organisms adapted to their unique conditions will encounter the surface world. Some will die, unable to survive in the new conditions. But others might thrive, and if any of them are dangerous, if any of them can outcompete terrestrial life or infect existing organisms, the consequences for global ecology could be severe. Climate scientists modeling Antarctic ice loss predict that significant melting could expose some subglacial lakes within the next 50 to 100 years. The timeline varies depending on emission scenarios and other factors, but the trend is clear. The ice is retreating. The hidden world beneath it will not remain hidden forever. This is why some researchers argue that controlled access to the lakes now, while we still have the ice barrier as protection, is actually the safer approach. Better to study what's there, understand it, prepare for it, than to wait for nature to expose it in an uncontrolled manner. But this argument assumes that study and preparation are possible, that we can understand and control what we find. Given the evidence from Lake Vostok, that assumption may be dangerously optimistic. The Russian government's long-term plans for Vostok Station are revealing. Despite the costs, despite the challenges, they continue to maintain and even expand the facility. New drilling operations are planned, using improved technology that will allow access to different parts of the lake, including the area directly above the anomaly. Construction of what appears to be a submarine facility has been detected in satellite imagery from 2021. A submarine in a lake beneath 4 kilometers of ice, accessible only through a drill hole. Why? The only logical explanation is that they intend to explore the lake more thoroughly, to approach the structure at the bottom, to study it directly rather than relying on remote sensors and water samples. This mission, if it happens, will be one of the most dangerous expeditions ever attempted. The pressure at the bottom of Lake Vostok is enormous. The water is cold, barely above freezing. Visibility is zero because no light penetrates to those depths. And then there's the unknown factor of the structure itself. If it's functional, if it responds to approaching humans the way it apparently responded to the drill, then the submarine crew will be at tremendous risk. They'll be in a vehicle that can't escape quickly, In an environment where rescue is impossible, approaching something that may be intelligent, may be defensive, and certainly possesses technology beyond our understanding. It's either incredibly brave or incredibly foolish, perhaps both. Why take such risks? Because the potential rewards justify them. If the structure can be accessed, if its technology can be retrieved or understood, if even a small fraction of its capabilities can be reproduced, the nation that achieves this will gain an insurmountable advantage. It's the same calculus that drove the space race, the nuclear arms race, every competitive technological pursuit in human history. But this time the stakes are higher because what's being pursued isn't human technology, isn't something that can be understood within our existing frameworks. It's genuinely alien, whether extraterrestrial or terrestrial ancient, and the risks of misunderstanding or misusing it are correspondingly greater. Other nations are not standing idle. The American Antarctic program has initiated Project Artemis, a classified operation whose details are scarce but which appears to involve advanced submarine drone technology designed for deployment in subglacial environments. China has established a new base called Kunlun Station in the interior of East Antarctica, positioned suspiciously close to several subglacial lakes that show magnetic anomalies similar to Vostok. The European Space Agency, ostensibly focused on space exploration, has been conducting high-resolution radar mapping of Antarctica using synthetic aperture radar satellites, producing images that can detect objects beneath the ice with unprecedented clarity. Everyone who has the capability is looking, searching, trying to be the first to make the next major discovery. And then there are the private interests. Corporations with the resources to mount Antarctic expeditions, tech billionaires fascinated by the possibility of recovering advanced technology, even religious organizations seeking evidence that would support or challenge their doctrines. Antarctica is no longer the exclusive domain of national governments. Private expeditions are being planned, though the Antarctic Treaty makes unauthorized activities illegal. But laws are only as strong as their enforcement. And in a place as remote and vast as Antarctica, enforcement is difficult. If a private group wanted to mount a clandestine expedition to one of the subglacial lakes, if they had the money and the equipment, they could probably do it before anyone could stop them. Whether they'd survive the attempt is another question. The indigenous guardianship perspective deserves consideration. While Antarctica has no native human population, some indigenous groups from nearby regions, particularly from South America, claim traditional connections to the continent and argue for a voice in decisions about its exploration. Their perspective, often dismissed by modern scientific and political establishments, includes warnings based on traditional knowledge. Stories passed down through generations speak of the ice lands as sacred, as places where the old ones dwell, where humans should not intrude. These warnings are usually interpreted as superstition, but in light of what's been discovered at Lake Vostok, perhaps they represent genuine knowledge, memories of ancient encounters or events that taught earlier peoples to fear what lies beneath the ice. We're reaching a critical juncture in the Lake Vostok story. The initial discovery has been made, the preliminary research has been conducted. Nations and organizations have positioned themselves for the next phase. The technology to thoroughly explore the subglacial environment is now available or nearly so. Within the next decade, we will almost certainly see major expeditions into Lake Vostok and other similar lakes. What they find will depend partly on luck, partly on preparation, and partly on how whatever exists down there chooses to respond to more aggressive human intrusion. The events of 2012 were just first contact, a tentative probe that resulted in confusion and retreat. The next contact will be more deliberate, more prepared, and consequently more dangerous. For those of us watching from outside, they're sort of dependent on leaked information and careful analysis to understand what's happening. The frustration is enormous. We live in an age of information where knowledge is supposedly democratized, where transparency is a stated value of most governments. Yet here is one of the most significant discoveries in human history, evidence that could reshape our understanding of life, intelligence, and our planet's history. And it's being kept secret. The justifications offered, national security, public safety, scientific integrity, they ring hollow when the real reason is obvious. Those in power want to control the discovery, to monopolize its benefits, to determine what the rest of humanity is allowed to know about our own world. This is why independent researchers continue their work despite harassment and obstacles. This is why whistleblowers risk their careers and freedom to leak information. This is why videos like this one exist, to piece together the fragments of truth, to present the evidence to anyone willing to consider it, to keep the pressure on authorities who would prefer to operate in silence. The more people who know about Lake Vostok, about the anomalies beneath Antarctica, about the questions that need answers, the harder it becomes to maintain the cover-up. Public awareness creates accountability, and accountability is the only force that can compel transparency from institutions that have chosen secrecy. So what can you do? First, educate yourself. Research Lake Vostok and Antarctic mysteries. Follow the developments. Watch for news about drilling operations and discoveries. Second, question official narratives. When governments or institutions make statements about Antarctic research, ask yourself what they're not saying, what they might be hiding. Third, support journalists and researchers who investigate these topics. They face significant opposition and need public backing to continue their work. And finally, demand transparency. Contact your representatives. Join or support organizations that advocate for open science and government accountability. Make it clear that the public has a right to know what's being discovered in Antarctica, that decisions about how to handle these discoveries should not be made by small groups in secret, but should involve broader societal input. The story of Lake Vostok is far from over. It's still being written, and how it ends, whether with revelation or continued concealment, whether with humanity rising to meet the challenge of what we've discovered or stumbling blindly into disaster, that depends in part on us. On whether we demand truth or accept lies. On whether we insist on our right to know or passively accept that others will decide for us what we're allowed to understand about the world we live in. The choice, as it always has been, is ours. But we can only make informed choices if we have information, and that information about Lake Vostok and the mysteries it contains is being deliberately kept from us. The Russian team that drilled into Lake Vostok in 2012, they opened a door. What lies beyond that door, whether ancient civilization or alien presence or something we have no concepts to describe, it's waiting. It's been waiting for millions of years. And now it knows we're here. The silence that fell over Vostok Station wasn't an ending. It was a pause. A moment of shock as both sides, human and other, confronted each other across an impossible divide. That pause is ending. The next chapter is about to begin, and when it does, when humans and whatever dwells in Lake Vostok meet again, this time with intention and preparation, the world will change, perhaps for better, perhaps for worse, but definitely forever. The ice is melting. The secrets are rising, and we're running out of time to prepare for what's coming. This is the truth they don't want you to know. This is the reality behind the silence. Lake Vostok is not just a scientific curiosity. It's ground zero for humanity's next great transformation. And that transformation, whether we're ready for it or not, has already begun.